You are so brave. I wish my generals were as brave as you. You all made history, and you are the real hero.
You are so courageous. I would like my generals to be as courageous as you. You all wrote history and you are the true hero. Raucous Misch was closer to Adolf Hitler than nearly anyone, standing by, observing, listening, guarding. Misch was the dictator's bodyguard and telephonist and saw the dictator not just as a figure of authority, but as an individual, mercurial, charismatic, merciless, and sometimes unsettlingly mundane. Misch once declared, "I was only a young soldier, Hitler's bodyguard, not a politician. I witnessed everything and lived." Now, his testimony strips away the layers of legend and distortion to reveal a Hitler the world has never really known. The last survivor of Adolf Hitler's last days has himself passed away. From clandestine discussions in the Reich Chancellery to hushed moments in the bunker, Misch's disclosures are breathtaking. This is not simply a glimpse of the monster of the past, it's a chilling portrait of the human being behind the madness. Joining the Führer's staff, Raucous Misch's journey into Adolf Hitler's inner circle was influenced less by ideology than by happenstance. Born in 1917 in what was then Silesia, Misch's both parents died when he was young and he was adopted by his grandparents. Like many young men in Germany during the 1930s, he was swept up in the wave of nationalism and joined the SS, the paramilitary wing of the Nazi Party, in 1937. Initially, it was a decision driven more by a desire for security and belonging than by deep political conviction. For young men such as Misch, the SS represented a secure future, steady wages, and a sense of belonging during the period when Germany was still recovering from the financial disaster of the Weimar Republic and the resentment of the aftermath of World War I. His fate rapidly changed. In 1938, Misch was chosen to become a member of the Leibstandard SS Adolf Hitler, an elite group originally created as Hitler's personal bodyguard. This was not an ordinary mission. The Leibstandard functioned at the uppermost echelons of Nazi leadership and consisted of only men who were considered absolutely devoted to the Führer. Membership took strict physical training, unwavering obedience, and undying loyalty to the Nazi cause, or at least the power to convincingly fake those qualities. The unit followed Hitler to public events, stood guard outside during private gatherings, and was a near-constant presence within the upper echelons of the Third Reich's leadership. By 1940, now just 23 years old, Misch had found himself drawn into the very center of Hitler's personal security detail, an assignment that would see him in close proximity to one of history's most hated men. He ultimately became one of a small group of people who were allowed to travel freely between Hitler's multiple headquarters. As Hitler's bodyguard, messenger, and later his communications officer, Misch was more than a bystander to the end of the regime, he was placed inside its inner core. That intimate access to Hitler would shape Misch's life forever and ultimately his legacy. Day to day within Hitler's inner circle, Raucous Misch was no typical personal bodyguard. He was employed in the innermost workings of the Nazi regime, stationed in personal rooms and fortified bunkers where decisions were made that shaped World War II. His responsibilities extended far beyond standing guard. Misch was tasked with keeping Hitler's private communications systems functioning, protecting telephone lines, passing key military messages, and manning encrypted radio and telex gear. His position afforded him special insight into some of the war machine's most sensitive and secretive functions. From 1940 to the fall of the Third Reich in 1945, Misch accompanied Hitler to almost every military headquarters. He attended the Reich Chancellery in Berlin, the Berghof in the Bavarian Alps, and above all the Wolf's Lair in East Prussia, Hitler's principal Eastern Front command center. It was there, in July 1944, that he narrowly escaped the unsuccessful assassination attempt by Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg, one of the best-known plots against Hitler. Misch saw the devastation that ensued in the wake of the blast and the consolidation of Hitler's inner circle afterward. In spite of the violent and extensive nature of the atrocities being committed by the regime he served, Misch maintained after the war that he was unaware of the acts being committed throughout occupied Europe. He said he was merely a dutiful soldier obeying orders, oblivious to the Holocaust or the machinations of Nazi extermination policy. But his access to power raised serious questions about his denials. Misch frequently was the first point of contact for cracking frontline reports and sat just outside offices in which top-level strategy sessions occurred. Meetings presided over by men such as Heinrich Himmler, Joseph Goebbels, Hermann Göring, and Albert Speer. He observed these men hurrying in and out, sometimes in flight, sometimes with frozen calm, as the war started to turn in Germany's disadvantage. And as Germany hurtled toward collapse, that role of quiet observer became increasingly perilous and complex. In the bunker with Hitler in his last days in April 1945, the once powerful Nazi regime was on the cusp of complete downfall. Berlin, the center of Hitler's empire, was being compressed from every direction as Soviet troops pushed remorselessly through the outer districts of the city. The European war was as good as lost, and the German army was in complete disarray. In the midst of destruction and turmoil, Adolf Hitler resolved to retreat from public eye and retire deep under the Reich Chancellery into the Führerbunker, a strongly fortified subterranean bunker complex intended both as shelter and command post in moments of utmost crisis. Among those who joined Hitler in this underground last stand was Rokas Misch. As the word went out to go underground, Misch tagged along unaware he was headed into one of history's most notorious death sites of the 20th century. Once trapped in the bunker, things grew desperate fast. The air was strained, heavy, and growing more paranoid by the minute. Hitler, now a shadow of the man who had once led armies from Europe, spent his last weeks giving delusional orders and fixating on alleged acts of betrayal. He refused to accept the complete depth of Germany's defeat, instead assuming that domestic treason and not Allied superiority in arms had brought the collapse about. Rokas Misch held his station during this psychological disintegration, keeping the bunker's most important communication systems up and running. But as Soviet guns rumbled louder by the minute and battlefield reports grew more desperate, even the most mundane tasks seemed unreal. The war outside was concluding in flames and ruin, but within the bunker the Nazi elite continued to hold on to their delusions of mastery, even as their universe fell apart. By late April, most of the city's defenders were either dead, captured, or in full retreat. Berlin had become a battlefield of desperation, and the bunker itself was now more prison than fortress. Inside, Joseph Goebbels, Hitler's propaganda minister, remained fiercely loyal. So did Martin Bormann, Hitler's private secretary. Not for 1 second did Misch think of abandoning the Führer. But even their determination couldn't mask the truth. The Third Reich was over. Adolf Hitler and Eva Braun killed themselves within the Führerbunker on April 30, 1945. Eva died of cyanide poisoning. Hitler, by most accounts, shot himself in the head. Rokas Misch was a few rooms away when it occurred. A short time later, Misch watched the corpses wrapped in blankets and wheeled past him up the stairs to the Chancellery garden. There, in line with Hitler's express wishes, the bodies were laid in a shallow shell crater, soaked in gasoline, and burnt. The aim was to ensure that the Soviet forces did not take possession of the corpses and use them as a horrific war trophy. Misch was underground for another 3 days following Hitler's death. The bunker was by then ominously silent, charged with a combination of fear, desperation, and resignation. Food was short. Ammunition was low. And least of all, they were aware that the Soviets were closing in on them. At last, with no alternative left and Soviet soldiers at the outer defenses of the bunker, Rokas Misch chose to escape. But his evacuation into Soviet captivity was not the end of the tale. It was the beginning of virtually a decade in captivity and a lifetime of silence. Upon exiting the bunker where he had spent the last days of the Third Reich, Rokas Misch was promptly taken into custody by Soviet forces advancing on the area. As Adolf Hitler's personal bodyguard and telephone operator, Misch was a prisoner of particular interest. Soviet military intelligence considered him a source of information with first-hand experience of Hitler's conduct, inner circle, and possibly even unannounced wartime strategies. As such, Misch was relentlessly interrogated. For the remainder of 9 years, he was transferred from one Soviet labor camp and high-security prison to another. The circumstances were harsh: bad weather, hard labor, meager rations, and minimal access to the world outside. Interrogations were regular and tireless. Soviet authorities were interested in finding out everything: Hitler's mental condition during the last days of the war, routines in the bunker, activities and discussions of other top Nazi leaders, and anything that could have been concealed as the Reich fell apart. Misch replied as much as he could but frequently said he didn't know anything more than what stood right before him. In 1954, almost 10 years since his capture, Misch was suddenly released. He returned to a transformed West Berlin, the city now divided by Cold War hostilities. Undeterred by the political turmoil and the permanent scarring of his detention, Misch went back into civilian life quietly. He opened a small business and decided to reside in the same neighborhood where he once grew up, as if attempting to regain a slice of the existence he enjoyed prior to the war. He lived in obscurity for many years. In contrast to some other former Nazis who were either prosecuted or fled into exile, Misch remained stationary. He was low-key, did not give interviews, and infrequently discussed extensively what he had witnessed or lived through during the war. At the start of the 2000s, though, raucous Misch unexpectedly re-entered the limelight. As the last remaining member of Adolf Hitler's inner circle, Misch started giving interviews, becoming a participant in documentaries, and eventually wrote a memoir called The Last Witness. To some, his return was an opportunity to hear directly what it had been like in Hitler's bunker in the last days of the Third Reich. But really, what shocked people wasn't what he recalled, so much as how he went about discussing it. Rather than expressing remorse or otherwise betraying any sense of guilt, Misch talked of time with Hitler in oddly affectionate, even nostalgic tones. He claimed he had been just doing his job. Nothing more, nothing less. In a 2005 interview with the Associated Press, Misch was asked the inevitable question: had Hitler ever discussed the Holocaust? His response was blunt and chilling. That was never a subject, never. He refused to deny the Holocaust, but he dissociated himself from it completely, saying he had never heard Hitler utter a word about it. 4 years later, in a BBC interview in 2009, Misch explained further. He acknowledged being aware that concentration camps existed. He even gave Dachau, the very first Nazi concentration camp created in 1933, its name. Again, though, he insisted that he did not know anything about the extent or ghastliness of what was going on inside them. To him, I knew of Dachau and concentration camps in general, but I wasn't aware of the extent. It wasn't part of our discussion. When asked if he had any remorse about serving Hitler so intimately, both as a bodyguard and as a member of his personal communications corps, Misch made a response that caught many people off guard: he was a great boss. I lived with him for 5 years. We were the 2 closest people who worked with him. We were always present.